Right now, 4 astronauts are orbiting the moon. It's the first time humans have been this far from Earth since 1972. But here's the real question no one's asking. Why did it take 54 years to go back? Because it wasn't a technology problem. We had the technology in the 1960s. We built it with slide rules and computers weaker than your phone. The reason we stopped going to the moon has almost nothing to do with engineering, and everything to do with politics, money, and a question nobody could answer. On May 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy stood before Congress and committed the United States to landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade. But this was never really about science. It was about the Cold War. The Soviet Union had already launched the first satellite, the first animal in space, the first human in orbit. America was losing, and the moon became the finish line. So NASA got something it has never received since: unlimited political support and a budget to match. At its peak in 1966, NASA consumed 4.4% of the entire U.S. federal budget. That's a level of funding normally reserved for wartime. And it worked. In July 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon. 5 more successful landings followed. 12 humans walked on the lunar surface. The last was Eugene Cernan, commander of Apollo 17. On December 14, 1972, he stepped off the surface and said he believed we would return, not too long into the future. He was wrong by more than 50 years. So what happened? How does the most technologically advanced nation on Earth land on the moon 6 times in 3 years, and then not go back for over half a century? The answer starts with Richard Nixon. He entered the White House in January 1969, 6 months before Apollo 11 even launched. And his priorities were different. The Vietnam War was draining billions. Domestic programs needed funding. The economy was under pressure. And the moon race had been won. NASA's budget had already started falling before Apollo 11 landed. 3 planned missions, Apollo 18, 19, and 20, were canceled outright. The hardware was built. The crews were trained. But the money was gone. By the mid-70s, NASA's share of the federal budget had dropped below 1%. Today, it sits at roughly 0.4%. 1/10 of what it was during Apollo. The most powerful rocket ever built became a museum exhibit. And the engineers who designed it moved on or retired. The production lines were dismantled. The factories retooled. The technical drawings archived and forgotten. This is something people don't realize about space travel. It's not like riding a bicycle. You can't just pick it up again decades later. The institutional knowledge, the millions of small decisions made by thousands of engineers, it lives in people, not in blueprints. And when those people leave, the knowledge goes with them. By the time anyone seriously talked about going back to the moon, NASA essentially had to start from scratch. In 1972, Nixon directed NASA to build something new. Not a moon rocket, a reusable space shuttle. The shuttle was marketed as a space truck, a vehicle that would make getting to orbit routine and affordable. It was supposed to fly frequently, reduce costs, and open up low Earth orbit to science and industry. It did none of those things. The shuttle turned out to be extraordinarily complex and expensive to operate. And it ended in tragedy twice. The Challenger disaster in 1986 killed 7 crew members. The Columbia disaster in 2003 killed 7 more. For 30 years, the shuttle consumed most of NASA's crewed spaceflight budget. Then came the International Space Station, which absorbed another 2 decades of funding and engineering effort. Both kept humans in low Earth orbit, and both kept them away from the moon. NASA didn't stop sending people to space. It just stopped sending them anywhere far. It wasn't for lack of trying. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush announced the Space Exploration Initiative, a plan to build a moon base and eventually reach Mars. It was canceled within 2 years. The price tag was too high and Congress wouldn't fund it. In 2004, George W. Bush launched the Constellation program to return astronauts to the moon by 2020. It got as far as building a test rocket. Then President Obama canceled it in 2010. Too expensive, too slow, too duplicative. Each new president reimagined NASA's mission. Each new Congress reshuffled the budget. The result was a 50-year cycle where ambitious moon plans were announced, partially funded, then killed before they could produce results. The moon didn't get further away. The political will to reach it kept evaporating every 4 to 8 years. But underneath all the politics and budget fights, there was a deeper problem. One that nobody wanted to say out loud. Why go back at all? Apollo's purpose was geopolitical. Beat the Soviets. Once that was done, there was no equally powerful reason to continue. Science could be done with robots for a fraction of the cost. There was no commercial incentive. No military necessity. Prestige alone doesn't survive budget negotiations. For 50 years, the moon didn't have a business case. And without one, no democracy will sustain the kind of multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar commitment that deep space exploration requires. So what finally changed? Competition. China landed a rover on the far side of the moon in 2019, a first for any nation. They announced plans to put astronauts on the lunar surface. Suddenly, the moon mattered again, not for science but for strategic positioning. At the same time, commercial spaceflight changed the economics. SpaceX proved that reusable rockets could dramatically reduce launch costs. Private companies began competing for NASA contracts to build lunar landers. And a new argument emerged. The moon isn't just a destination. It's a proving ground. Water ice at the lunar South Pole could sustain a permanent base. The technology developed for the moon would be needed for Mars. And this time, NASA wouldn't do it alone. Commercial partners would share the cost and the risk. On April 1, 2026, NASA launched Artemis II. For astronauts Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen lifted off from Kennedy Space Center on a 10-day mission around the moon. Victor Glover is the first person of color to travel beyond low Earth orbit. Christina Koch is the first woman. Jeremy Hansen is the first non-American. Today, as they fly around the far side of the moon, they're breaking the record for the farthest distance any human has ever been from Earth, surpassing Apollo 13's mark set in 1970. They'll reach 252,000 miles from home, further than any human in history. And unlike Apollo, this isn't a one-off stunt. Artemis III is planned to test lunar landers. Artemis IV aims to put boots back on the surface. The goal this time isn't just to visit the moon. It's to stay. 54 years. That's how long it took to get back to this view. And here's what makes this story uncomfortable. We didn't lack the ability to return. We had better computers, better materials, better engineering than the 1960s within a decade of Apollo ending. What we lacked was alignment. The technology, the money, the political will, and a compelling reason, all four had to exist at the same time. For 54 years, they never did. Artemis isn't just a space mission. It's proof of how difficult it is for modern democracies to commit to anything beyond the next election cycle. The moon was always there, 8 days away by rocket. Close enough that we reached it with slide rules and analog circuits in 1969. The distance was never the problem. The commitment was. And once you see that, the 54-year gap stops looking like a mystery and starts looking like a warning.